The dust hung heavy in the air as Rose Yancy stepped onto the worn porch of her modest homestead just outside Portland, Oregon. 1873 had been unkind to her, the harsh winter following a drought that had stolen what little prosperity the town could claim. But it was the consumption that took Richard last spring that had truly broken her heart. As she leaned against the weather-beaten railing, her gaze fell upon the approaching figure of a man on horseback, his silhouette wavering in the heat of the late afternoon sun. Preston Parker drew his horse to a stop, his broad shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The cattle drive from Montana had taken more out of him than he cared to admit, especially now that he'd passed 40. The years of hard living etched deep lines into his weathered face, but his eyes remained alert, taking in the small ranch with its struggling garden and the lonely figure of the woman watching his approach. "Madam," he called out, removing his hat. "Pardon the intrusion. Name's Preston Parker. My horse has thrown a shoe, and I was hoping I might trouble you for some water and perhaps directions to the blacksmith in Portland." Rose studied the stranger carefully. His clothes were dusty but not ragged, his revolver holstered but not flaunted like some of the troublemakers that occasionally pass through. Most importantly, he had kind eyes, tired but honest. "There's water in the well out back," she replied, gesturing with a slight nod. "Portland's blacksmith closed up shop last month. Nearest one now is in Salem, about a day's ride south." Preston's face fell at the news. "I appreciate the information, madam, and your name would be—" Rose Yancy." She hesitated, then added, "There's a small stable behind the house where you can rest your horse. I've got some tools in the shed. I'm no blacksmith, but I've patched a shoe or two in my time." Preston's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Yancy. I wouldn't want to impose." "It's Miss," she corrected automatically, then flushed slightly. Though it was Mrs. until last spring, understanding passed across Preston's face. "I'm sorry for your loss." Rose nodded, accepting his condolence with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to live with grief. "Bring your horse around back. I'll fetch the tools." As Preston led his chestnut mare around to the stable, he took in the modest homestead. The small cabin showed signs of care despite its age-patched roof, swept porch, and neatly stacked firewood. A woman alone maintaining all this spoke of formidable determination. Rose emerged from a weathered shed carrying a leather satchel of tools that had clearly seen years of use. "These were my father's," she explained, setting them down on a workbench inside the small stable. "He taught me a thing or two about horseshoes before he passed." Preston removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves. "My father was a farrier back in Pennsylvania. I picked up some skills myself, though I've spent more years herding cattle than shoeing horses." Together they worked on the mare's hoof, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed tools between them. Rose noticed calluses on Preston's palms that matched her own evidence of a life of hard work. "What brings you to Oregon, Mr. Parker?" she asked as she held the hoof steady. "Preston, please," he replied, carefully examining the loose shoe. "I've been driving cattle from Montana down to California for the past few years. Thought I'd try a different route this time, see some new country. There's talk of good grazing land opening up near Portland." Rose's expression tightened slightly. "There's land, but I wouldn't call the grazing good. We've had 3 dry years in a row. Many ranchers have already moved on." "Including your husband?" Preston ventured carefully. She shook her head. "Richard had consumption. The doctor said the damp Oregon winters didn't help, but he loved this land too much to leave." Her voice softened with memory. "He built this place with his own hands, promised we'd grow old here together." Preston worked in silence for a moment, respectful of her grief. "It's a fine piece of land," he offered finally. "You've kept it up well." "Some days better than others," Rose admitted. "The well's running low and the garden's barely producing enough to keep me fed, let alone have anything to sell in town." They finished setting the shoe and Preston led the mare out to test her gait. The horse moved easily, no longer favoring her front left hoof. "Good as new," he pronounced with satisfaction. "I'm much obliged to you, Miss Yancy." Rose brushed the dirt from her hands. "You're welcome to water your horse before you move on." And she hesitated, glancing at the setting sun. "There's stew on the stove if you'd care to stay for supper. It's simple fare, but hot." Preston looked surprised at the invitation. "That's mighty hospitable." "I'd be grateful for a home-cooked meal before I head into town." As they walked toward the house, Rose suddenly felt self-conscious about the simplicity of her home. It had been months since she'd had a visitor beyond the occasional neighbor checking in on her. The inside of the cabin was modest but meticulously clean, with a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, and a sitting area with a rocking chair and an overstuffed armchair that had been Richard's favorite. Preston removed his hat upon entering, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "You've got a real nice place here." "It's small, but it suits me," Rose replied, moving to the stove where a pot of rabbit stew had been simmering. "Please have a seat." As she ladled the stew into bowls, Preston took in the details of her home. A small bookshelf held perhaps 24 volumes, a luxury in these parts. A patchwork quilt hung over a rack near the fireplace, its colors rich despite obvious age. They ate at the small table, the conversation flowing more easily than Rose had expected. Preston told her of his years driving cattle, of the vast Montana skies and the treacherous mountain passes of the Sierras. She found herself laughing at his tales of stubborn steers and greener-than-grass cowboys on their first drives. "How long have you been on the trail?" she asked, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Nearly 20 years now," Preston replied, his eyes distant with memory. "Started when I was just 23, fresh from Pennsylvania with notions of adventure. The West has a way of beating romantic ideas out of a man pretty quick. Yet you stayed." He nodded, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Couldn't imagine doing anything else, living anywhere else. There's a freedom out here you can't find back east." "Richard felt the same way," Rose said softly. "He came out on the Oregon Trail in '50. Said he knew this was home the moment he crested the mountains and saw the valley spread out below." "You're not from here originally?" Preston asked. Rose shook her head. "I came out with my parents in '58. We settled near Salem initially, but I met Richard when I was teaching school in Portland. He convinced my father this land had potential." As night fell, they moved to the sitting area. Preston insisted on bringing in more firewood before settling into Richard's old armchair. The flames cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls as they continued talking. Rose found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years about her childhood in Ohio, her dreams of having a school of her own someday, the happiness she'd found with Richard despite the hardships of ranch life. "He sounds like he was a good man," Preston said quietly. "The best," Rose agreed, her fingers absently stroking the arm of her rocking chair. "We had 12 years together, not enough but more than some get." The clock on the mantel chimed 9, startling them both with the realization of how long they'd been talking. "I should be on my way," Preston said, rising from the chair. "The boarding house in Portland might still have a room." Rose glanced out the window at the darkness. "It's a moonless night and that trail can be treacherous after dark. There's an extra bedroll in the storage room if you'd like to sleep in the stable. It would be safer to ride out at first light." Preston hesitated, clearly not wanting to impose further but seeing the wisdom in her suggestion. "If you're certain it wouldn't be an inconvenience." "Not at all," Rose assured him, already moving to retrieve the bedroll. "Consider it payment for the stories of your adventures. It's been nice having company." After showing Preston to the stable and ensuring he had what he needed for the night, Rose returned to her cabin. As she prepared for bed, she caught herself humming a tune she hadn't sung since Richard fell ill. The realization brought her up short, a mixture of guilt and confusion washing over her. One evening of pleasant conversation with a stranger shouldn't dispel a year of loneliness. Yet as she climbed into her cold bed, Rose found herself wondering what it would be like to have a man's warm presence in the house again. When dawn broke, Rose was already up, tending to her few chickens and starting breakfast. She'd half expected Preston to have ridden out already, but when she glanced toward the stable, she saw smoke rising from the small chimney. He'd lit the stove she kept there for cold mornings when she needed to tend to animals. A few minutes later, Preston appeared, his face freshly washed and his hat in his hands. "Morning, Miss Yancy. I hope I'm not overstepping, but I noticed your woodpile was running low, so I split some of those logs out back before the sun was up." Rose blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to do that. Seemed only fair, given your hospitality," he replied with a shrug. "Besides, it's been a while since I've done honest work that didn't involve pushing cattle from sunup to sundown. Well, I appreciate it. There's coffee on the stove and eggs frying if you'd care to join me for breakfast before you head out." They ate on the porch, watching the sun climb above the distant hills. Rose found herself reluctant to see this man ride away, carrying with him the brief respite from solitude she'd enjoyed. "What will you do now?" she asked as Preston helped her clear the dishes. With the blacksmith gone and grazing land so poor, Preston leaned against the porch railing, considering, "I've got some money saved. Might look at land further north near the Columbia. Or head back to Montana for another cattle drive." He paused, looking out over her struggling fields. "Or I might stay around Portland for a spell. Sometimes a man gets tired of always moving on." Rose felt her heart quicken unexpectedly at his words. The town could use good workers. "The sawmill's always hiring, and there's talk of the railroad expanding this way." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed your fence needs mending on the south side, and that barn roof has a spot that won't last another winter. I could help with those repairs before I move on." "As payment for your help with my horse." Rose wanted to refuse, to maintain her hard-won independence, but the practical reality of her situation won out. The work needed doing, and Preston seemed genuinely willing. "I can't pay you," she said frankly. "Room and board would be fair compensation," he suggested. "Just until the work's done. A week, maybe 2. Rose considered his offer. Having a man around this man in particular would certainly make the coming days less lonely. But it also meant letting someone into the carefully ordered solitude she'd built around herself since Richard's death. "All right," she agreed finally. "But only until the repairs are finished." Preston smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Then we have a deal, Miss Yancy." That afternoon, Preston rode into Portland to send a telegram to his trail boss, explaining his delay. When he returned, he brought supplies from the general store: nails, roofing tar, and a few tools Rose didn't have. He also surprised her with coffee beans of better quality than she'd been able to afford for months, and a small sack of sugar. "You didn't need to bring gifts," she protested when he presented them. "Not gifts," Preston corrected. "Necessities for a hard-working ranch hand. Can't mend fences on weak coffee." The next days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Preston rose before dawn each morning to tend to the animals and chop wood before Rose awoke. They'd share a simple breakfast, then work side by side on the various repairs the homestead needed. Preston proved to be skilled with his hands, methodical in his approach to each task. By the end of the first week, they'd repaired the chicken coop, mended the south fence line, and begun work on the barn roof. Rose found herself watching Preston when he wasn't looking, appreciating the careful precision with which he worked, and the respect he showed for Richard's craftsmanship in the original structures. "Your husband built things to last," Preston commented one afternoon as they replaced a rotted support beam in the barn. "Just needed a bit of care to keep them that way." "He always said anything worth doing was worth doing right," Rose replied, handing him a nail. Preston nodded in agreement. "Wise man." As they worked together, Preston shared more stories of his travels, painting vivid pictures of the Badlands, the Rockies, and the vast plains of Kansas. Rose found herself laughing more than she had in years, especially when he recounted his misadventures as a young, inexperienced cowhand. "First time I tried to rope a steer, I somehow managed to lasso my own horse's feet," he admitted, chuckling at the memory. Sent us both tumbling into a mud hole. The trail boss wouldn't let me live it down for months. In turn, Rose told him about her life with Richard, the difficult first years on the homestead, the devastating loss of their only child to fever when he was just 3, the dreams they'd shared for expanding the ranch someday. After Tommy died, she explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass, we never had another child. The doctor said it wasn't likely to happen. Richard said God had other plans for us. Preston was quiet for a long moment. I never married, he said finally. Came close once back in Pennsylvania. Sarah was her name. Her father didn't approve of my plans to go west and she wouldn't go against his wishes. Do you regret it? Not settling down? Preston considered the question seriously. Some days. When I see a family gathered around a table or watch a man teaching his son to ride. But then I remember all I've seen, all the places I've been that most men only read about. It seems ungrateful to wish for more when I've been given so much. As the second week of Preston's stay drew to a close, the list of necessary repairs dwindled. The barn roof no longer leaked, the fences were sound, and the chicken coop secure against predators. Preston had even managed to improve the irrigation to Rose's garden, diverting water more efficiently from the creek that ran along the edge of her property. On what was to be his final evening, Rose prepared a special supper, a roast chicken with vegetables from her garden and an apple pie made from the last of her preserved fruit. As they ate, a heavy silence hung between them, neither wanting to acknowledge his imminent departure. Finally, as Rose served the pie, Preston cleared his throat. I've been thinking, he began, then paused, uncharacteristically hesitant. The livery stable in Portland is without a manager. The owner offered me the position when I was in town yesterday. Rose set down the pie plate, her heart suddenly racing. Are you going to take it? I'm considering it, Preston replied carefully. It would mean staying in one place, something I haven't done in nearly 20 years. Might be time to put down some roots. Portland's a growing town, Rose said, trying to keep her voice neutral. There are worse places to settle. Preston nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. The position comes with living quarters above the stable, but they're small, barely room for one person, let alone. He trailed off, and Rose found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue. The thing is, Rose, Preston said, using her given name for the first time, these past 2 weeks have been the most at peace I've felt in years. Working this land, sitting on this porch in the evenings. Talking with you. Rose's hands trembled slightly as she cut the pie. It's been nice having help around the place. Is that all it's been? Preston asked quietly. She looked up then, meeting his gaze directly. No, she admitted, that's not all. Preston reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. I don't want to disrespect Richard's memory. I know your heart still carries that grief, but I'm wondering if there might be room in it for something new in time. Rose felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I don't know, Preston. I never thought I'd, she broke off, unable to articulate the confusion of emotions his words had stirred. Preston squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking for promises, Rose, just possibility. I could take that position in Portland, help out here when you need it. We could see where time leads us. Rose withdrew her hand slowly. I need to think. This is all so unexpected. Of course, Preston agreed immediately. I didn't mean to overwhelm you. We can talk more tomorrow before I ride out. They finished their meal in awkward silence, the easy camaraderie of the past 2 weeks temporarily disrupted by the weight of unspoken feelings and future possibilities. After supper, Preston excused himself to check on the horses one last time, giving Rose space to collect her thoughts. She washed the dishes methodically, her mind racing. The idea of Preston staying in Portland both thrilled and terrified her. She'd grown accustomed to her solitude, had built walls around her grief that kept her functioning. Letting someone new into her heart meant risking that pain again. Yet these past 2 weeks had reminded her how empty her life had become. Preston's presence had brought laughter back to her home, had eased the burden of constant work, had given her someone to share thoughts with beyond her own silent reflections. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Rose glanced out the window to see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. A summer storm was brewing, the kind that often hit with little warning in these parts. She hoped Preston would return from the stable before the rain began. Minutes later, the sky opened up, rain pouring down in sheets. Rose lit the lamps and stoked the fire, concern growing when Preston didn't appear. Finally, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and was about to brave the downpour when the door opened, admitting a thoroughly drenched Preston. "Goodness," Rose exclaimed, taking in his soaked appearance. "You're wet through to the skin." Preston removed his hat, water streaming from the brim. "Storm came on faster than I expected. Wanted to make sure all the animals were secured and the barn was battened down." "You'll catch your death in those clothes," Rose said, falling back on practical concerns to mask her lingering emotional turmoil. "There's a chest in the spare room with some of Richard's things. They might be a bit short in the sleeves, but they're dry." Preston hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion. "I don't want to." "Richard wouldn't have wanted good clothes to go to waste," Rose interrupted firmly. "The spare room is down the hall. You can change there while I make some hot coffee." When Preston emerged a few minutes later, Rose felt a strange jolt at the sight of him in Richard's old flannel shirt and trousers. They were indeed too short in the arms and legs, but otherwise fit reasonably well. Preston looked equally uncomfortable, tugging self-consciously at the sleeves. "I hung my clothes by the stove in the stable to dry," he said. "They should be ready by morning." Rose nodded, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "The storm's getting worse. You might as well sleep in the spare room tonight. No sense getting soaked again going back to the stable." Preston accepted the coffee gratefully. "If you're sure it's appropriate." "We're both grown adults," Rose replied practically. "And it's hardly the first time a ranch hand has slept in the house during bad weather." They sat by the fire, listening to the rain hammering on the roof and the occasional boom of thunder. The tension from dinner had eased somewhat, replaced by a different kind of awareness of Preston in Richard's clothes, of him staying in the house proper rather than the stable, of the narrowing distance between them. "I've been thinking about what you said," Rose ventured finally, staring into her coffee cup. "About staying in Portland." Preston remained quiet, giving her space to continue. "I spent a year pushing away any thought of companionship after Richard died. It felt disloyal somehow to imagine another life." She looked up, meeting Preston's steady gaze. "But these past weeks have reminded me that Richard wouldn't have wanted me to live alone forever. He always said life was for the living." "He sounds wiser with each story you tell," Preston said softly. Rose smiled slightly. "He was, and he would like you, I think. You have the same straightforward way about you, the same respect for hard work." "That's high praise." "It is," Rose agreed, "which is why I think I'd like it if you stayed in Portland. Not with any promises or expectations, but just to see where time might lead us." Preston's expression warmed, relief and pleasure evident in his eyes. "I'd like that too, Rose, very much." The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tension had eased. They talked late into the night, making tentative plans. Preston would take the position at the livery, find his footing in Portland. He would ride out to help with the heavier work on weekends, perhaps bring supplies from town. They would take things slowly, allowing Rose time to reconcile her past with this unexpected new beginning. As the clock struck 11, Rose stifled a yawn. "I should show you to the spare room. It's not much, but it's comfortable enough." The small room had served as storage more than accommodation in recent years, but Rose had maintained it with the same care she showed the rest of the house. A narrow bed with a clean quilt stood against one wall, a small dresser and washstand completing the sparse furnishings. "This will do fine," Preston assured her. "I've slept on the ground under the stars more nights than I can count. A real bed is luxury." Rose lingered in the doorway, suddenly awkward. "Well, good night then." "Good night, Rose," Preston replied softly. "And thank you not just for the room, but for being willing to consider a new path." She nodded, unable to find adequate words, and retreated to her own bedroom. As she prepared for bed, Rose was keenly aware of Preston's presence just down the hall, the first man to sleep under her roof since Richard's passing. It felt both strange and somehow right, as if the house itself had been waiting for this change. In the spare room, Preston sat on the edge of the bed, taking in his surroundings. The small room spoke of Rose's care. The quilt was faded but meticulously mended, the floors swept clean, even a small vase of wildflowers on the dresser. It was a far cry from the boarding houses and trail camps he'd called home for 2 decades. As the storm continued to batter the homestead, both Rose and Preston lay awake in their separate rooms, contemplating the unexpected turn their lives had taken and the cautious possibilities that lay ahead. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind puddles in the yard and a freshly washed feeling to the air. Rose rose early as usual, only to find Preston already in the kitchen, brewing coffee. He changed back into his own clothes, now dry from their night by the stable stove. "Hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Thought I'd get it started before heading into town." "Not at all," Rose replied, smoothing down her hair self-consciously. She wasn't used to having someone see her before she'd properly prepared for the day. "You're leaving already." Preston nodded. "Thought I'd catch the livery owner early before he offers the position to someone else, but I'll be back tomorrow if that's all right. The north fence could still use some work." "Tomorrow would be fine," Rose agreed, a smile tugging at her lips despite her attempt at nonchalance. After a quick breakfast, Preston saddled his mare and prepared to ride out. Rose walked him to the edge of the yard, an echo of their first meeting just 2 weeks earlier. "I'll bring supplies when I return," Preston promised, mounting his horse. "Is there anything in particular you need from town?" Rose shook her head. "Just yourself," she said softly, then flushed at her own boldness. Preston's face lit up with a smile that reached his eyes. "That I can manage." He tipped his hat to her and rode away, turning once to wave before disappearing down the trail toward Portland. Rose watched until he was out of sight, then returned to the house, which suddenly seemed emptier than it had in years. True to his word, Preston returned the next day with supplies and news that he'd secured the livery position. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Preston would spend 5 days in Portland, managing the livery and establishing himself in the community, then ride out to Rose's homestead for the weekend, arriving Friday evening and departing Sunday afternoon. With each visit, he brought not only practical supplies but small luxuries. Rose had long denied herself: good tea, a new ribbon for her hair, seeds for flowers rather than just vegetables. More importantly, he brought companionship, easing the isolation that had defined her life since Richard's death. Together they completed projects around the homestead that Rose had been forced to neglect. The vegetable garden expanded, the chicken flock grew, and by mid-autumn the house and outbuildings were in better repair than they'd been in years. Their relationship progressed with cautious but steady steps. The first time Preston took her hand as they walked to check the creek after heavy rains, Rose felt a flutter of both guilt and anticipation. The first time he kissed her goodbye before riding back to Portland, a chaste brush of lips against her cheek, her heart raced like a schoolgirl's. As autumn deepened toward winter, their conversations turned more serious, addressing the practical realities of their situation. Preston found the livery work satisfying but missed the open spaces and honest labor of ranch life. Rose admitted that while she had managed alone, the homestead flourished with an extra pair of hands to share the work. On a crisp November evening, nearly 4 months after their first meeting, Preston arrived at the homestead earlier than expected. Rose was surprised to see him riding up the trail on Friday morning rather than evening. "Is something wrong?" she asked as he dismounted, concern evident in her voice. Preston smiled, easing her worry. Nothing wrong, just took the whole day off. Thought we might ride into Portland together tomorrow for the Harvest Festival, if you'd like. Rose hadn't attended the annual celebration since before Richard's illness. I'd need to find something decent to wear, she said, already mentally inventorying her limited wardrobe. I'm sure you'll look beautiful in anything, Preston replied, the compliment flowing naturally now where once it would have been awkwardly offered. That evening after supper they sat by the fire as usual, Preston in Richard's old armchair, Rose in her rocker. The November chill made the warmth of the hearth particularly welcome, and Rose found herself watching the play of firelight across Preston's features as he read aloud from one of her books. When he finished the chapter, Preston closed the book and looked up to find her studying him. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly. Rose smiled. "I was just thinking how different this winter will be from the last, how much has changed since you rode up with a thrown horseshoe." Preston set the book aside. "Good changes, I hope." "Very good," she assured him. "I never expected to feel content again. After Richard died, I thought that part of my life was over. And now?" Preston asked, his voice gentle but direct. Rose met his gaze steadily. "Now I find myself looking forward rather than back. It's a gift I never thought to receive." Preston rose from the armchair and knelt beside her rocker, taking her hands in his. "Rose, I've been thinking a great deal about our situation. The arrangement we have now works well enough, but winter's coming. The trail between Portland and here will be difficult once the snow flies." Rose nodded, having considered this problem herself. "I know, we may need to reduce your visits until spring." "That's one option," Preston agreed, "but I've been considering another." He took a deep breath. "Rose Yancy, I love you. I didn't come to Oregon looking for a wife, but I found one all the same if you'll have me." Rose's breath caught in her throat. Despite the growing closeness between them, despite her own deepening feelings, she hadn't expected a proposal so soon. "Preston, you don't need to answer right away," he interrupted gently. "I know Richard still holds a place in your heart. He always will, and that's as it should be. But I'm hoping there's room for me too, not as a replacement but as a new chapter." Tears welled in Rose's eyes. "There's already room for you," she whispered. "I've loved you for weeks now, though I've been afraid to say the words aloud." Preston's face transformed with joy. "Then say them now." "I love you, Preston Parker," Rose declared, her voice growing stronger. "And yes, I will marry you." Preston pulled her into his arms, his kiss far more fervent than the chaste pecks they'd exchanged before. Rose returned it with equal passion, the last of her reservations falling away. When they finally parted, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I was thinking we could marry before Christmas. That would give us time to prepare and to figure out what to do about the homestead and my position at the livery." "What do you mean?" Rose asked, suddenly concerned. "I don't want to leave the homestead. Richard built this place for us, for me." Preston squeezed her hands reassuringly. "I wouldn't ask you to leave. I was thinking I'd give up the livery position and move here. This land has potential, Rose. With both of us working it, we could make it profitable again." Relief washed over her. "You'd give up your position in town." "Your steady income," in a heartbeat, Preston confirmed. "I've been a wanderer most of my life, Rose. What I want now is a home with you." They were married 3 weeks later in Portland's small church. With the few neighbors Rose had maintained connections with and Preston's new acquaintances from town in attendance. Rose wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, with the new ribbon Preston had brought her woven into her upswept hair. Preston wore a new suit purchased for the occasion, looking uncharacteristically formal but undeniably handsome. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the elderly pastor beaming as he pronounced them man and wife. As they rode back to the homestead that evening, now their shared home, snow began to fall, the first of the season, dusting the landscape in pristine white. "A good omen," Preston declared, helping Rose down from her horse. "Fresh snow, fresh start. Before she could step onto the porch, Preston swept her into his arms. "I believe there's a tradition to uphold," he said, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was warm, the fire having been banked that morning to await their return. Preston set Rose down gently, then moved to stoke the flames back to life while she lit the lamps. As the room brightened, Rose saw a small package on the table that hadn't been there when they left. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up. Preston looked up from the fireplace, a smile playing at his lips. "A wedding gift. I asked Mrs. Thornton from next door to leave it for you while we were in town." Rose carefully unwrapped the package to find a small, intricately carved wooden box. Opening it, she gasped at the delicate gold locket nestled within. "It was my mother's," Preston explained, coming to stand beside her. "The only thing of value I've kept all these years. I've carried it in my saddlebag, thinking someday I might have someone to give it to." Rose lifted the locket reverently. "It's beautiful, Preston. I'll treasure it." "Open it," he encouraged. Inside, Preston had somehow managed to fit a tiny photograph of the two of them, taken in Portland just a week earlier by a traveling photographer. On the opposite side was a lock of dark hair. "That's Richard's," Preston explained quietly at her questioning look. "I hope you don't mind. I found it in the locket you keep in your drawer. I thought he should be with us today in a way." Tears spilled down Rose's cheeks. "That's the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me," she whispered, overwhelmed by his understanding. Preston fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin. "You're my wife now, Rose Parker. But you were Rose Yancy first, and I would never ask you to forget that part of your life." Rose turned in his arms, her heart full to bursting. "I love you, Preston Parker, more than I can say." Their kiss sealed the promise of their new life together, built on respect for the past and hope for the future. The first winter of their marriage brought challenges along with its joys. Heavy snows isolated the homestead for weeks at a time, and resources grew thin before spring's thaw. But with Preston's strength and Rose's resilience, they not only survived but laid plans for expansion. By spring, Rose discovered she was with child, a blessing neither had dared hope for given her previous difficulties. Preston's jubilation at the news was matched only by his protective concern, insisting Rose rest more and let him take on the heavier chores. Their son, Thomas Richard Parker, was born the following November, a healthy, robust baby with Preston's dark hair and Rose's blue eyes. As Rose nursed the infant before the fire on a cold winter evening, Preston watched from Richard's old armchair, now unquestionably Preston's own after more than a year of use. "He's perfect," Preston murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Rose smiled up at her husband. "He is, and hungry. Would you bring me that blanket? He's starting to fuss." Preston retrieved the blanket draped over the back of the sofa, the patchwork quilt Rose had kept carefully preserved since Richard's death. It had gradually made its way back into everyday use during their first year of marriage, Rose finally ready to see it as a comfort rather than a relic. "I never asked," Preston said as he gently tucked the quilt around Rose and the baby. "This quilt, it seems special to you. Did Richard make it?" Rose shook her head, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns. "No, my mother made it for Tommy, our first son. After he died, I couldn't bear to use it, but I couldn't part with it either." Richard understood. "He kept it folded at the foot of our bed all those years, never questioning why I needed to keep it." Preston settled back into his chair, understanding deepening his already profound love for this woman who had overcome so much loss. "And now it's keeping our son warm." "Life continues," Rose said simply, looking down at the nursing infant. "We carry what we can from the past, but we keep moving forward." The baby finished nursing and fell asleep in Rose's arms, his tiny fist curled around her finger. Preston took him carefully, settling the sleeping infant against his shoulder with practiced ease despite having been a father for only 2 months. "Why don't you get some rest?" he suggested. "I'll put him down in a bit." Rose nodded gratefully, the long day of chores having taken its toll despite Preston's help. She kissed them, both her husband and her son, before retiring to their bedroom. Left alone with his sleeping son, Preston paced slowly around the cabin, humming softly. The homestead had changed over the past year and a half, expanding to include a new storage shed and improved corral. They'd added 2 milk cows and increased the chicken flock, making the ranch more self-sufficient. Come spring, Preston planned to expand the garden again and perhaps add a few head of cattle if their savings allowed. Eventually, the rhythm of his pacing and the warmth of the fire lulled Preston himself towards sleep. Rather than risk waking the baby by moving, he carefully settled into his armchair, adjusting Thomas securely against his chest. The sound of soft breathing from both man and infant filled the cabin as Preston's eyes drifted closed, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of the day's labor. Rose woke an hour later, concerned when Preston hadn't joined her in bed. She wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and padded quietly back to the main room of the cabin. The sight that greeted her made her heart swell with love. Preston had fallen asleep in his chair, their son still cradled protectively in his strong arms. The firelight played across their faces, so similar in some ways, yet Preston's weathered by years of sun and wind, Thomas's still perfection of newborn innocence. Moving silently, Rose took the patchwork quilt from the sofa where it had been left. With infinite care, she draped it over both of them, tucking it gently around the baby and her sleeping husband. As she stood watching them, Rose was struck by the symmetry of life cycles. Once long ago, her mother had lovingly made this quilt for a child who left too soon. Rose had preserved it through years of grief, a tangible connection to her first son. Now it sheltered a new generation, a symbol of how love persists even through loss. She brushed a gentle kiss against Preston's forehead, careful not to wake him. "Sleep well, my loves," she whispered. In his sleep, Preston smiled slightly, as if somehow aware of her presence, of her love surrounding him just as surely as the quilt she'd kept through years of loneliness. Now kept him warm. Rose returned to bed, her heart full. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their homestead in hushed white, while inside, the family she'd never expected to have slept peacefully, wrapped in the warmth of both fire and history. With the arrival of spring, the Parker homestead flourished. Preston had proven to be as skilled with crops and animals as he had been on the cattle trails, his years of varied experience bringing new techniques to the land Richard had established. Rose, with baby Thomas often secured in a sling across her chest, managed the household and garden with her customary efficiency. As the years passed, their family and prosperity grew together. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them 2 years after Thomas, her fiery personality evident from her first lusty cries. Preston expanded the cabin, adding 2 new rooms to accommodate their growing family. The once struggling homestead became known throughout the region for its fine horses, which Preston bred and trained with remarkable skill. By the time Thomas was 5 and Elizabeth 3, Rose found herself expecting their 3rd child. The pregnancy was difficult, causing Preston no small amount of worry, but the result, twin boys they named James and William, brought immeasurable joy to the entire family. Through it all, the patchwork quilt remained a constant presence in their home, spread on the grass for picnics in summer, wrapped around feverish children during winter illnesses, and always returned to its place of honor in the main room, a tangible reminder of the paths that had led them to each other. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Preston surprised Rose with a party, inviting neighbors and friends from Portland to celebrate. As twilight fell, the guests departed, leaving the Parkers alone with their 4 children, all now tucked into bed after the excitement of the day. Rose found Preston on the porch, gazing out at the land they'd nurtured together. At 53, his hair had turned completely silver, but his back remained straight, his hands strong and capable. "Happy anniversary, my love," she said, joining him at the railing. Preston slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. 10 years. Sometimes it feels like we've always been together. Other times it seems like just yesterday that I rode up with a thrown horseshoe. Rose leaned her head against his shoulder. Best horseshoe that ever came loose, if you ask me. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge above their land. At 45, Rose remained as beautiful to Preston as she had been that first day, perhaps more so for the shared history written in the fine lines around her eyes and the silver threading through her dark hair. "Do you ever regret it?" Preston asked suddenly. "Marrying a wandering cowboy instead of finding some respectable townsman after Richard passed?" Rose looked up at him in surprise. "What brought this on?" Preston shrugged slightly. "Just thinking about paths taken and not taken, how different our lives might have been." "I have never, not for one single moment, regretted loving you," Rose said firmly. "You gave me a second chance at happiness when I thought that part of my life was over. You've been a wonderful father to our children, a partner in every sense of the word." Preston pressed a kiss to her forehead. "And you've given me the home I never knew I needed until I found you." As they stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, surrounded by the family they'd created, the legacy of loss that had once defined Rose's life had transformed into something else entirely not forgotten. Never that, but woven into the fabric of a new tapestry, just as the threads of her mother's quilt had been repurposed from grief into comfort. In the years that followed, the Parker homestead continued to thrive. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his father's practicality with his mother's love of books. Elizabeth, fiercely independent, showed a remarkable talent for horsemanship that rivaled Preston's own. The twins, different as night and day despite their identical appearance, brought constant activity and laughter to the household. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to attend university in San Francisco, the first in either Rose's or Preston's family to pursue higher education. Though proud beyond measure, they felt the bittersweet pang of watching their firstborn prepare to leave the nest. On Thomas's last night home before his journey, the family gathered for a special dinner, each of his siblings presenting handmade gifts for him to take to California. Rose gave him her father's pocket watch, Preston, a fine leather journal embossed with the Parker ranch mark. Later that evening, as Preston sat in his familiar armchair reviewing breeding records for the spring foals, Rose noticed him nodding off, the day's work and emotional weight of Thomas's imminent departure taking their toll. With practiced ease, she took the ledger from his hands before it could slip to the floor. Preston stirred slightly but didn't wake, his breathing deep and regular. Rose smiled at the sight of him, still handsome after all these years, still the man who had brought light back into her life when she'd resigned herself to shadows. Moving quietly, she took the patchwork quilt from its place on the sofa and gently covered her sleeping husband. The quilt, faded now from years of use and washing, had sheltered every member of their family at one time or another, a constant through all the changes life had brought. As she tucked it around Preston's shoulders, Rose thought of that long-ago evening when he had first fallen asleep in this very chair, their newborn son on his chest. The grief that had once threatened to consume her had not vanished but had been transformed, woven into the richer tapestry of a life fully lived with all its joys and sorrows. Preston's eyes fluttered open briefly as he felt the weight of the quilt. "Rose," he murmured sleepily. "SHH," she soothed, brushing silver hair from his forehead. "Rest now, everything's fine," he smiled, already drifting back to sleep. "Love you," he whispered. "And I love you," Rose replied softly, "now and always." As Preston's breathing deepened once more, Rose remained beside him, her hand resting lightly on the quilt that had witnessed their journey from strangers to beloved partners. Outside, the stars shone over the land they'd nurtured together, while inside, the home they'd built sheltered the family neither had dared hope for, a testament to love's capacity to bloom even in soil once salted with tears. The patchwork quilt, created in love, preserved through grief, and now a symbol of their shared life, continued its purpose, providing warmth, comfort, and a tangible reminder that even after the greatest losses, the heart retains its remarkable ability to heal, to hope, and to love again.